Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Please take a moment, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I haven't checked recently, but I think we're up over, I think we're like 50 or less people away from getting to 8,000. So we're getting really close. So, anyways, about half the people who watch every episode haven't subscribed yet. So if you're one of those folks, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Today we are going to talk about the book Abolish Rent. I have read it. I don't have my physical copy behind me yet because I don't have a physical yet, but I read it in digital, and it's a fantastic book. Really, really enjoyed reading it. It's available now. There should be a link in the show description. I'll drop one in the chat as well. You can purchase it. It's now available through Haymarket Books, and they have it on sale currently, 20% off for the paperback, 40% off for the ebook. It's kind of a combination. I'll let them talk about it a little bit more of what it is. That's one of the questions I want to ask. But it's kind of a combination of sort of a manifesto, some great sort of case studies, storytelling, which for those who have read, this was my first time interacting with Leonardo, and I'm looking forward to that. But having interacted and read some of Tracy's work before, it always kind of combines those elements of storytelling and theory and practice, really thinking about the practices that people are engaged in. And, again, the book really good. And it's short too, I mean, not like too short, but it's a quick read. So, that's a nice thing for some folks who, may have less time, so. And I really encourage people too, if you do housing organizing, tenant organizing of any kind, I think it's a great book for study groups and things like that. So, all right, let me introduce our guests. So, Tracy Rosenthal is a writer and co-founder of the LA Tenants Union. Their work has been published in The New Republic, The Nation, and the LA Times, among others. They serve on the advisory board of Housing, the Third Reconstruction with UCLA's Institute on Inequality and Democracy. They are now on rent strike in New York City. Leonardo Vilchis has been organizing tenants in Boyle Heights for more than 30 years, trained in liberation theology. We're going to come back to that because that's an interesting part of the book too. He co-founded Union de Vecinos in 1996 to stop the demolition of the Pico Aliso public housing projects, winning the right of return for 250 families. In 2015, he co-founded the LA Tenants Union to organize tenant power on a citywide scale, merging with LATU, LA Tenants Union, in 2019 to form the Union de Vecinos Eastside Local. Union de Vecinos has maintained a leadership role defending the long-term community against gentrification and displacement. Vilchis was an activist in residence at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy in 2020, and now serves on the advisory board of its Housing, the Third Reconstruction research endeavor. He lives in Los Angeles. So without further ado, I'm going to bring our guest to the stage. Welcome. Good to be with you both. Let's start with just kind of giving you an opportunity to give folks a sense of this book, and what this book is. As I said, Tracy, you and I have had a couple conversations over the years. In our first one, which was on the audio podcast a couple years ago, we touched on the LA Tenants Union to some degree. Leonardo, it's great to be in conversation with you. So start with some of what this book contains and kind of, your vision and purpose, like what you were thinking about when you wanted to write this book of this is what we want to do with it.
So, I mean, I can start, and I can also show everyone the book. Jared, we got to get you a physical copy. I didn't know you didn't get yours yet. But yeah,
I'm sure it's coming.
I have a stack, so I can make that happen. If you have any trouble, let me know. But yeah, so I think that, like maybe we'll just say I'll just start by saying two things. Like what we wanted from the book was to give our readers a real understanding of our housing system, our economic and political system, how it works, how it came to be where it is. And like that result, right, is that the average landlord spends 4 hours a month maintaining a property, and it takes 4 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford the average 2-bedroom rent. So how did it come to be that landlords can extract so much from us and have so much power over our lives, like where and how we can live, when they do so little work, right? And this is one of the questions that the book tries to answer by putting housing and housing policy in the long history of class struggle and explaining, the long project of class domination that we call in the book the war on tenants, right? So like we wanted to give readers an understanding of the economic system that, our former mayor, Eric Garcetti, could say something like, in a good economy, homelessness goes up, right? Like, how did that come to be? And then also we wanted to give people an understanding of our political system that ends in the figures of, which I think, like the 4 hours of work for 4 minimum wage jobs, it can be represented in the figures of Donald Trump and Breonna Taylor, right? Like a slumlord found guilty of violating fair housing law, who became the president of the United States, and a Black woman who was murdered by Louisville PD for standing in the way of a real estate development scheme. And so that this is sort of the, like the first chapter is really like about our economic system that prioritizes property values over tenants' human rights to and human needs for housing, like goes through what rent is, and how it takes from us and traps us in this like economic relationship of exploitation. And then the second chapter goes through like, what is the history of housing policy? And oftentimes we hear about that from the perspective of its winners, like as the long democratization of home ownership. But from the perspective of tenants, what we see is a systematic assault. And that's why we call that the war on tenants, like the war on crime and the war on drugs. And so, those are kind of the two, like that's one side of what we wanted to equip people with. And then the other is, we wanted to give people the tools to feel like they can intervene, right? Like if we're situating the housing, like if we're situating our housing system in the context of class conflict, then we're one side of that conflict. And we need the tools and we need each other to intervene in our lives right now. So like the next half of the book is, we tell the stories of poor and working class people who are being politicized by their struggle to keep their housing, to stay in their long-term communities, or even to protect their encampments in public space. And, we really hope that by like showing how people were successfully able to intervene in what seems like in what seems like a totalizing system, right? Like we want other people to get involved, to organize, to take calculated risks with their neighbors wherever they are.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in addition, not been an organizer in Boyle Heights for the last 30 or 40 years. It's been a long, long time. I don't even know how to count. But I think for me, what's important to understand and to have a discussion, a conversation with other organizers or leaders in the community, because there in the American tradition, there's a whole understanding of what community organizing is that means lots of different things in the everyday life of people. For us, community organizing starts with the construction of community, the development of relationships across the neighborhood and across people, and in the stories to show how out of the everyday life of the community, we have the signs, the tools, and the mechanisms to resist capitalism. And in the process of construction and organization, how do we build ourselves within the larger context of the struggle against capitalism? So it's not just all these like campaigns to win or a strategic achievable and some strategic achievable and measurable goals. It's basically a lot of stuff that has to do with the everyday life of people building themselves as resistors against capitalism, and then again building the organization that joins the struggle to change the system as we know it right now. And I think these stories help us understand how we can start from that perspective.
Well, we love that here. And that's yeah, no, it's great. And I think that the book does that. So I wanted to start because, the title, the subtitle of the book is How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. And I know, Tracy, this is something you and I have discussed, that, the mere framing of a housing crisis is an issue, but I appreciated that, the kind of naming of it and the thinking about ending it. So um just both of you, like, what is the housing crisis within our society in your view?
We can hear you, Tracy.
Oh, sorry, Tracy. You're
Oh,
muted.
I'm unmuted. I got it. So yeah, I mean, I'll just start and say, we wanted to understand our housing system from the perspective of tenants themselves, right? And to understand our housing system with the intervention in mind that the purpose of a system is what it does, right? And what does our housing system do? It puts trillions of dollars into the hands of landlords and real estate speculators, and it ejects tenants into the streets, right? So in the decade of the 2000s, landlords took in $4.5 trillion from tenants in rent payments. And we know more than 600,000 people are homeless every night in the richest country of the history of the world, right? So framing the consequences, what we argue is that framing the consequences of a housing system as a housing crisis, right, ignores that from the perspective of its winners, the system works just fine, right? The capitalist housing system isn't designed to provide the best quality housing to the most tenants. It's designed to maximize profits and extract the most rent. And in the process, it immiserates tenants and prevents them from even having access to the basic human need of a home, right? So when we think about who is in crisis, what is in crisis, right? It's tenants. We are traumatized by being displaced from our long-term communities. We live incredibly precarious lives where our homes can be the place where we make our communities and live out the deepest part of our emotional selves can be pulled out from under us at any moment. We take on extra work. We stuff ourselves into overcrowded spaces, right? We give up our medication and and forego food. And we are at risk of the premature death that is in many ways, homelessness is a slow death sentence, right? And this is the crisis, right? The idea that we have to pay for a human need, that our access to a home is structured by the profit motive. That is the crisis, right? And so when we say in the book, we say rent itself is the crisis, right? That power relationship that forces us to hand over our wages as a monthly tribute to a landlord who is already richer than us, right? And so this isn't just the dispassionate outcome of supply and demand, which adequately distributes the resource of housing, right? This is exploitation and domination, right? So the system itself is built on those things, is built on exploitation and domination. We say, one of the things that I want people to remember is this idea that we pay rent at the peril of our need and at the barrel of a gun, right? We don't just pay rent because it's a human need to have housing. We pay rent because if we don't, our landlords can stick the sheriffs, the cops, the agents of state violence on us to physically eject us from our homes. And then if we end up outside, we can be criminalized, jailed, harassed by those same agents of the state because we find ourselves simply like with nowhere else to go, right? So like, we don't pay rent just because we have to have housing. We pay rent because it's a crime not to have it, right? It's a crime not to be exploited by a landlord. Like, that is the crisis. The system of exploitation and the system of domination that rests on landlords, real estate speculators collaborating with the state and the agents of state violence to ensure, to discipline us such that we must pay. And that, I think, is really like, you know, the intervention that we want to make, that we think actually like empowers people to take on this system that we're in and to demand the kind of transformation that we would need to live in a world without homelessness, to live in a world without displacement, to live in a world where like the places where we live support us and actually support us in the fullness of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, and Tracy said everything pretty much. The thing is that there is no solving the housing crisis inside capitalism, and if you understand that, then you understand that the tenants in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their cities have to be part of the process of ending the housing crisis, and with it changing the system as we know it. And basically, when we talk about the appropriation of labor, the product of labor, it is the housing is itself part of that process, right? Everything that Tracy said, you make your income to get paid and all stuff, and then you give the rest of it to the landlord. So there is no place anymore for you to have anything else. And housing, I mean, in the recent communications with our tenants, basically a lot of the things that I talk about is housing is like water. You know, without water, you just can't live. And if someone is buying it and holding it and putting it in bottles and bottling it up for you, well, they're taking away your ability to have a life. And that's the same thing with the housing, right? And this crisis has existed forever. When you look back and read the conditions of housing in the 19th century, you see exactly the same stratification of the conditions of housing. People living on the streets, people that accumulated in their own homes, whole families living in single rooms, slum housing. It is the system itself. And tenants themselves have to see themselves as how this operates within the system. When we fought against the housing, the demolition of public housing, we started hearing the nonprofits pretty much repeating and saying, this is how the system is, this is how it's stratified. There's people with more money, there's people with little money, and there's people who live on the streets. And every one of them has a specific place from which we struggle, right? So the homeless are in this place, the public housing people are in this place, and everything else. So the system itself also segregates us, when in reality, the whole housing crisis, the whole housing situation, it is the system itself. And tenants, the people who live on the streets, the students who cannot afford their housing, the renters, and even the homeowners who are held up by the banks have to figure out how to change the system so they don't have to choose between paying for rent or paying for medical expenses.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the question of power. You know, often tenants it feels like a very powerless situation often. So where does tenant power come from, which is something you talk about in the book, and maybe give some examples of where you've seen this be successfully wielded by tenants, which is something that the book definitely gives examples of.
Leo, do you want to start on this one? You can.
I think that part of what we talked about earlier is the whole question of ideology, right? It's basically the right to own a home right now within the context where we live in is basically the right to own the place that you live in, and which creates all sorts of situations there. When public housing residents, it is the shame that you live in public housing. For renters, is the aspiration that someday you have. So I think at some level, we need to look at the ideology and people's understanding of why do they live under these conditions. And a lot of things that have happened during our struggles with organized tenants is that people realize that they have paid for their housing over and over and over and over again. So the tenant power exists in the understanding of this relationship, understanding how this accumulation of capital that is going to the landlords or the institutions is really what we're producing for them. And for us, in community, in our locals, in our housing, in our buildings, is when people start talking to each other about these issues that they start realizing then is the capacity to organize themselves. But I mean, in a funky way, I think it's first understanding that relationship where the power comes from. And that's what we've seen. I mean, I think the way Tracy explains it, a lot of times the whole idea of the day that you don't pay rent, you realize that your housing is not going to fall apart. I hope you can say that later, Tracy. But basically, the moment that tenants say, this is my home because I paid for it, this is our community because we've been organizing, we've been helping each other. The moment they say that is when power emanates, is when power becomes a reality. When we start changing our conditions, is when the landlord starts getting scared of the tenants, is when the police start realizing they cannot just walk and knock on people's doors and start harassing them and scaring them into moving out. Is when the larger community, in our context, the larger community says, oh, housing is part of the economy, it starts realizing that their solutions are no longer functioning. And we're seeing it in Los Angeles, where the mayor and the non-profits and the citywide movement are running out of options. And there's a movement of tenants that say, no, we want more, we want better, and we're fighting for it. And we're actually challenging the notions that are behind that. But yes, it starts with breaking down this notion that people have that somehow they're losers because they don't have control of their housing. And somehow they realize that they actually are empowered because they're already occupying the houses that they live in, and because they have already paid for them, constructed them, repaired them, and have built their everyday life that they want and they need in those homes.
Yeah, I think, I'll do your assignment, right? And I think that what Leo is talking about is the way that, part of what builds tenant power is the organization of a tenant union, right? The union exists to use the technology of organizing, which we call in the book the alchemy that turns shared vulnerability into shared power, right? Alone, we are subject to the whims of landlords and speculators. We can be easily picked off and victimized by this housing system that exists to exploit us and dominate us. But together, we actually can find in our daily lives and in our buildings the solidarity that we need to reverse those relationships, right? And so, we see this. I think this is basic movement math, right? There are more of us than there are of them, but we need to act in coordination with each other to make that power felt. And so I think that, we can talk about how what it takes to really move someone from a space of shame. Leo, it would be great. Maybe you could talk about the pandemic and how we were after I finished that. I feel the way that we had so much of our work in that time was dealing with people's shame that they could not pay. And I feel you should talk about that. But I guess I'll just say, right, oftentimes when people are organizing, the experience of we should acknowledge the experience of terror that lodges itself in our physical buildings, right? That because our lives are structured around gathering together the resources to make this monthly tribute, it really feels if we challenge any part of that relationship, the entire building might collapse. And that's often what tenants say when they they'll, even when they do a repair and deduct action, just withholding a little bit of rent so that they can actually take care of the needs that they have in their housing that their landlords are rejecting, right? They're afraid that the building itself will collapse. This is how deep these structures of powers go. But then, what we see over time is that by taking that action, right, by withholding rent and managing the resources ourselves and putting it and seeing it through such that the housing we live in is now improved, people actually experience more ownership of their housing suddenly, right? So even though you're in a more precarious relationship because you just took a risk with your neighbors to withhold some rent and put it in your housing, right? You actually then that challenges the legal relationship that you're in, the contract that says you're supposed to pay rent. Actually, what people experience by taking that step together is a sense of power, is the actual, is collective ownership. And we see that then forward in the context of a rent strike, right? Like, I think one of, like the basic building blocks of union power is the strike. And we see this with labor, and we also see this in tenant organizing, right? That like the withholding of rent is a fundamental economic sanction that reveals how dependent the landlords are on us rather than the other way around, right? And so when we can wield that collective power, right, we are raising the costs. We are like making it costly for our landlords, and I think that like that is really like obviously the high watermark of building tenant power. But then, of course, there are also all kinds of like collective actions. I just talked about repair and deduct, and I think that that's such an important one, because it is an escalation on the way to reclaiming our housing. But it's about really saying, like, if you won't manage these, if you won't take care of our housing, we will. And similarly, there are other forms of direct action that tenants can take together to experience their power, right? Oftentimes when tenants like will get an eviction notice, right, it is the most terrifying day of your life, right? As I said before, the discipline of getting thrown onto the streets is what forces us to come up with the resources to pay this monthly tribute, right? But what oftentimes what we've seen is that like we can raise the social cost of our landlords evicting us, right? Like the kinds of reputational damage that we can do by showing up to their neighborhoods. We had a tenant association show up at a wedding of a landlord who was evicting someone, right? To really like escalate, because, like if it's, we often say like, if this is, our housing is personal for us, and it should be personal for the people that are evicting us too, right? And so I think that there are all kinds of strategies, both like economically, like in the context of a rent strike, and in repair and deduct, and also in like other forms of collective action that we can take in protest of this relationship, that actually by bringing tenants together helps us build power by experiencing that power. And then, yeah, just to say like that that is the organization, like organization is what moves people from like a union is what makes people recognize that they're not alone, right? Like it is that shared sense of, the antidote to feeling alone and feeling powerless is feeling the community and the solidarity of an association, of a union, of a local chapter, of a tenant movement.
Yes, I think it's very important also to look this also within the tradition of struggle in the United States. And, I'm old and I've been in different moments in the struggle, but I've remembered several moments within the struggle, people say, oh, you cannot organize so-and-so, at some point, immigrants, there was this whole talk about you cannot not organize immigrants. First, they have to become citizens so they can have what power. And the reality is, if you look at California, immigrants have change the politics of the state in so many levels, and that is why we're in the so-called hopefully good Democrats. But the reality is it was the movement of immigrants and refugees that were coming here that had that change. In another context in my history, day laborers and janitors were not organizable, and the same thing. And now you have around the struggles around service sector and around the day laborers. And tenants, here we are with the tenant situation, and in the United States has been industrialized. You have to ask yourself, where is the working class? Where are the workers? Where basically most of the people are in the gig economy, in the informal economy. So that's where the power is. It's people living in their homes, in their neighborhood. That's where the power is to change society. So just at the most basic level, that's where the power is. So that's where they have the power. In another level, we can see it in recent events. So yes, the pandemic is the best place where we can see this happening. People were living under miserable conditions, in bad housing, not being able to afford the rent. And then the pandemic comes and people lose their jobs and they're pushed into the streets. And I remember within an organization, we had the case solidarity workers coming and saying, people cannot pay rent, people cannot pay rent. And this whole notion of people cannot pay rent, sorry for the dog, this whole notion of people cannot pay rent really made it very, very clear that that people were being forced and pushed to the wall in this situation. And when they chose to say, we have to pay for our food, we have to pay for our healthcare, we have to pay for other emergency situations, and we're not going to pay rent. That had not only was a choice, but it was a militant position saying, you know what, forget it. We're not going to pay rent. We're going to start doing the other things. And that's when it showed us that the construction of everyday life, the construction of people living in their homes, the aspirations to have a better life, had to be executed by the tenants themselves. Them coming together, show their power. And when we launched in Boyle Heights, the first rent strike that said food, not rent, that's when we started changing the conditions. After we made that position, after the tenants themselves started taking that stance, the government started floating the money to the landlords, started floating the money for all the services. The tenant organization started saying, oh yeah, we're going to help you get all this money. The whole economics of the system started changing, not in the favor of the tenants, but started changing those conditions. Later on, as the conditions of the pandemic still prevail and the economic crisis still exists, more rights are being developed for tenants. And in Los Angeles, every day we have a new right, a new protection, a new everything. The bad news is that you have to fight it in court. So now I think the next level is going to be the fight in the courts. But little by little, the power of the tenants is exercising and appearing in the conditions where they say we're not going to pay rent, in the conditions where they force the state to have a response, and in the conditions where legally we're having more and more rights. So the power is there. The question is how to build organization that makes that happen, because also we cannot live on the myth that just people by themselves do these struggles, right? Society, the laws, the system has changed by organized struggle by the people who are most affected by those conditions. So tenants right now are the brunt of financialization. I'm sorry, they're hitting the brunt of the industrialization of the United States, and they're also hitting the brunt of imperialism, which basically says to keep our wars somewhere else, we have to take away from all these subsidies, take away from all these places. So people living on the street, people living in the neighborhood, people living in these buildings are really the power that has the capacity to change the conditions that we live in.
Right on. Yeah, and the puppy's cheering you on. So uh Um, I'm going to read an excerpt, a quick, short excerpt. So, had the tenants turned to most available resources, the helpline at LA's housing department, elected officials, constituent services, or LA's few overburdened legal aid efforts, they likely would have been told nothing could be done. Established legal services respond to conflict between landlords and tenants as casework for individual clients, the outcome of which is prescribed in advance by current tenant law. Lacking capacity to support a lengthy process with uncertain ends, most nonprofit organizations treat collective action as a liability to be avoided rather than a road to victory. For government representatives, the mariachi tenants could serve as an example of why laws might need to be changed. They could be a point they could be pointed to as a symbolic leverage for a long legislative process in order to benefit others in the future after they'd tragically but inevitably lost their homes. In the procedural arenas of courts and elections, tenants are helped only after harm has occurred. They are victims, passive objects of political intervention rather than political agents themselves, end quote. So I wanted to talk about this. I mean, you're talking about a range of problems here. Recently we had a conversation on the South African shack dwellers movement, Abatlali. And I was struck by some of the similarities I found reading your book, as I was also reading Yusuf al-Balushi's book on Abatlali. And in terms particularly of kind of this notion of organization and then autonomy, and thinking about autonomy from some of these outside influences that are often dressed up as the political actors that can help us, whether this be, um, politicians or lawyers doing legal aid efforts or nonprofit organizations as well. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that element, about the importance of self-organization as opposed to going to those other forces to seek help.
Mhm. Well, maybe I could just give a little context for, and that I think is a really good example of this process. So this passage comes from we have a chapter devoted to the rent strike and the mariachi tenants in Boyle Heights, a 26-unit building, which was not rent stabilized, bought by a new landlord, who then proceeded to issue rent increases to the tune of $800 a month to these tenants that had been living there for decades, a third of whom were mariachi musicians who relied on the proximity to Mariachi Plaza to pick up work. So they were living in this context where, to lose that home would mean to lose their livelihood also. And so, when these tenants were facing their options, like according to the law, that building was not subject to rent stabilization. The landlord could charge whatever, this is the line, whatever the market could bear, right? Which is another way of saying like to the however maximally they can exploit tenants while resting on the power of state violence and the fear of eviction in order to do that. And so that was the context. And what the tenants managed to do through a year-long rent strike is transform basically the legal ground of their building such that they won a collective bargaining agreement that is equivalent to rent stabilization for their building. So I think it's really important, when we think about the law and legal struggles and how tenants are funneled into thinking about what is possible to do, and as constrained in advance by legislation, as constrained in advance. And what these tenants showed is it's actually possible with collective action to change the governing structures of your building. And I think that we should think about this more broadly, right? Laws only exist because of struggle, right? The base laws that we have in this country that govern our housing only exist because of historic tenant struggle. The mass rent strikes in the Lower East Side that gave us any form of rent stabilization, as well as just the basic requirement that you have to live in habitable housing and an eviction process, right? These are all things that were won in the blood and lives of the tenant movement. And so when we understand the legal system from that perspective as a result of tenant struggle, and when we see these individual examples of tenants taking control over their own futures, right? By saying what the law is not right, right? It may be legal, right? This may be what's legal, but it certainly isn't right. And so, we quote James Boggs, who says rights are what you make and what you take. And this is an example of tenants who were able to make new laws that govern their own buildings, to take their take their power back as tenants and change those conditions. And so I think that I feel like when we understand the role of struggle, it really encourages us to look not towards the legislative process, which demands a sort of conciliatory stance towards the legal aid lawyers or the client services, right? Which are taking defensive stance, and actually come together to think about what is it with our organized leverage? What is made possible by our organized leverage? And is it beyond any of those conciliatory or defensive stances, right? These tenants in some ways started with the risk of being ejected from their homes and ended up with more stable housing than tenants across the city, right? So I think that really shows, how that orientation to building power together is both both novel, but also so important if we want to change the conditions that we're in. And I know I've gone on, but I do have a lot to say about the shack dwellers too. So come back around.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the prior question, and one of the things that actually talking about the shack dwellers, when we met with several of them at different occasions, and one of the things that I learned that is really, really stuck with me, and that we talked a lot about here, and I don't know how it's going to sound within the larger context of your audience, but one of the things that they say is like, you're a citizen of the place that you live in. And when you start from that point of departure, the whole notion of citizenship gets broadened and explored into a whole completely different notion, right? And so if we're talking about a world of struggle centered on the life of tenants as citizens, then it means that the rights are produced by the tenant's life and the tenant's organization and the tenant's struggle itself. And here's the big contradiction that we've been living with. And in a historical sense, Unión de Vecinos, when we started fighting against the housing projects, the demolition of the housing projects, people told us, that's the way it is. The federal government is changing its policies, and therefore now all public housing is going to be demolished and it's going to be privatized, and you must accept it. That was, the nonprofit organizations that depend on the foundations, that are subcontractors of the larger system that says how we're going to maintain the system without any complaining. So they were telling us there is nothing you can do because that's what's going to happen. But the residents in public housing were saying, no, these are our homes, this is our community, and we cannot allow for somebody else to destroy them. So it was centered of the tenants who were deciding that public housing was for them, belonged to them, and they needed and deserved it. 30 years later, we're seeing that public housing, now called social housing, is essential. So a tenant-centered perspective tells us that we do need social housing. When the tenants are calling for a rent strike, and we're organizing tenants for a rent strike, the lawyers were saying, oh, your chances of winning are very weak because you don't have the documentation, you have this stuff. But by centering on the tenants, you know that the rent strike and the withholding of rent is the basis of changing things. But if you're an attorney and you're only thinking of how you fight it in court, it's not going to happen. When the nonprofit developers told us, oh, we need to fight for more housing, we were saying, no, we already have the housing. We need to fix it and repair it and do it and all this stuff. And yes, build the housing for the unhoused. Don't build the housing for us. Build for the house. Help us repair our housing. And again, it's the tenant-centeredness of all this stuff, and so on and so forth. But it is only when the tenants are organized that they develop this knowledge, this understanding. And when they have this knowledge and this understanding, they build the division of labor, the institutions, the attitude and the vision of what is to be done, what needs to be expected from society and from its institutions. And that's when we have to force the contradiction. We have to force the contradiction of organized tenants, an organization centered on the tenants themselves that starts making the decisions. And that's what we have in the tenants union, the perspective of the everyday life of the tenant, of what needs to happen so everybody has the right life and the right place that they can live in. And that's what I think is very, very important in this whole issue, to center, to have that perspective of the most poor, the most marginalized. And I think that's for us, popular education, liberation theology, the focus on the most poor as a point of departure. I just came back from Mexico, and basically the president, with all these contradictions, of course, the president said, first we start with the most poor, so everybody has a better life. That's pretty much the perspective that the tenants have in the tenants union. First, we start with the most marginalized, and from there we start building the system that we need. And we have to have the organization, and we have to be in the struggle with institutions that supposedly are doing it for us. Because that's another thing I think was very important. Before the construction of the tenants movement in Los Angeles and the tenants union, and of course going back to its historical origins, everybody was helping the tenants. It wasn't the tenants themselves who were taking the lead. With the tenants union, the tenants put themselves up front, and they're the ones who take in the lead in the demands, in the formulation of demands, in the definition of what is the knowledge that is necessary, and the production of the ideas that drive the campaigns. Now, everybody else has to respond. And as I said, the pandemic showed us that once the tenants organized it, we're not going to pay rent, forget it. Everybody else had to reorganize to figure out a response to the system. And now we're going to force the legal system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I also just wanted to say of the shack dwellers too, that it really speaks to the internationalism of our movement. And I think that we really see this in our focus in the book, in the last chapter on land struggle, right? And we, we talk about organizing with the unhoused tenants who lived for almost 2 years in Echo Park Lake, built an encampment of over 150 people. And at that place, they reclaimed this public park in the context of complete abandonment by the state during the crisis of the pandemic. And what they did was organize to meet their needs. They organized to meet their needs for housing, for a place to be, by distributing supplies, tents, tarps, outdoor equipment. They organized to meet their need for food by bringing in resources from the community, building a community kitchen. They had access to the public bathrooms, which are a human need. And they fought, by linking arms with organizers to block the Parks Department and the police from shutting down those bathrooms at night, right? They organized to claim that resource. They built showers. They constructed a garden so that they could feed themselves. And what we saw, I think, we often think about, right, as Leo was saying, organizing from the position of the most poor, right? That is an occupation of space where people are organizing to meet their own needs. And the state understood the massive threat that posed to, the speculation of that specific neighborhood in Echo Park, to the use of homelessness more broadly as the discipline that forces us to continue to pay rent, and mobilized a police force of over 700 people to clear that encampment, to displace people at gunpoint. And so I think that, by thinking about unhoused tenants as the vanguard of our movement, right? As they teach us about what it means to occupy space. And we say too, when tenants are on rent strike, they're turning the occupation of our home into an occupation of our home. And we have that power as tenants. Simply by staying put, you in many ways are standing in the way of what your landlords, real estate speculators, and the state's plans are for how that housing should be used to and extracted for the purposes of extraction and consolidation of wealth. And I think that the shack dwellers movement, really, I think this is one sense in which we are aligned on aligned internationally with this struggle for reclaiming, not just housing, but land. How is land going to be managed and used? How do we actually democratically redistribute our resources? And I think, as Leo began with, how do we become citizens of the places where we live? Well, that takes the building of these institutions so that we actually have control over what happens to us in our houses, in our blocks, and in our neighborhoods, and beyond that too.
So I think, and also, a citizenship also means a relationship to the state. And I think another thing that we learned from the shack dwellers, they're in opposition and in contradiction with the ANC, which was the liberating party that came after apartheid and started changing those conditions. But now they're basically a threat to the state, and they find themselves in contradiction. And I think this is very important in these moments in the United States. When we talk about the Democrats versus Republicans, really none of them being able to address the conditions and the problems of society. We live in the richest state with the supposedly most progressive governor in a city that is very progressive, the largest city, all Democrats, and their ability to address our problems has ended. I mean, completely has ended. There is no solution coming out of nowhere. So an organized community that is trying to come up with its own responses, it's showing the inadequacies of the larger system. It's showing the inadequacies of the party. It's showing the inadequacies of the democracy as it exists. And yes, it becomes a threat. The response now is violence and attack and these contradictions. And that's why we must build the organization. We must build the organization with the structures, with these representations, with the way that people talk about these things, but also the organization where we struggle these ideas, because I think there is this notion that, let the tenants themselves figure out, and that's what's going to happen. No, we need an across class and race and gender solidarity that builds this movement centered on the most poor, centered on the most marginalized. And the shack dwellers also has been able to do that, right? So they're not just the shack dwellers fighting their fight themselves. They have organizers, they have lawyers, they have a whole system that they have built to fight that. But they're pointing to the inadequacies of the state. And I think the tenants union in Los Angeles and the larger movement of tenants union is showing that we have reached the limits. There has to be a different way, a better way of doing things. And that is the history of struggle and change in the United States. That is the history of struggle across the world. When people realize that when they organize, that they come together and they build a solidarity movement across themselves, everything changes. That was the civil rights movement. That was the slave movement, the anti-slavery movement. All of these processes come out of the most oppressed, the most marginalized, coming together, and then the world that is built around it in support and solidarity, following that vanguard, following that leadership. And we hope that in our context, this is what we're building.
Appreciated. I'm actually there's some great questions coming up in the chat. A lot of organizers, folks from tenant unions and so on. And so I want to bring in some of them. And maybe I'll come back to some of my other questions later, but they have really good ones. So I wanted to bring some of those in. So Dindi Katanga, who's an organizer in LA who works with unhoused people, just asked if there's any thoughts on how we can build tenant unions or organizations by unhoused people and those who don't traditionally have a landlord. And obviously, Tracy, you just gave an example from the Echo Park situation, but a little bit more maybe on that question of organizing and I know that your union considers tenant as a kind of a broad term. So yeah.
I think you're great at the state is the landlord, so go for it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that we, I think just to make it clear, right? We define tenant as anyone who doesn't control their own housing, and that is really important to us because you don't get ejected from our solidarity just because you get ejected from your homes, right? Like we, people who live outdoors, stand in opposition to our capitalist housing system, and as much as tenants do, and more. And so I think that, to answer your question, I mean, I think that what we found in organizing, I think that there's different roads. But oftentimes, like, I don't think that there is a special, like, I think it would be dehumanizing to suggest that there are any sort of organizing techniques that might be completely different for organizing people who live outside and people who live indoors. Oftentimes, people who live outdoors have more urgent needs. And I think that, I think when I organize and I door knock and I go talk to my neighbors who are outdoors, I'm often just asking the question, like, what do you need? What are the needs of the community? What is this community organizing to do? Like, what is happening? Like, what's going on here? Right? Like, that's the question that we started the LA Tenant Union with. Like, what are you hearing in your communities? Like, what's going on? And so I think that by asking those questions, right? Like I often think of organizing as a practice of listening, right? Like, can you listen to what people are asking for? And then can you ask, like, well, what do we have in this community already? How can we use our own resources that are here? And how can we draw on the solidarity that we know exists to provide for those needs? And so I think that starting with those basic questions, then I think helps us build the relationships of trust and solidarity that we need for community defense. And I think that you know, and I think that oftentimes, you know, like oftentimes social networks exist before we get there. And so like recognizing, you know, like recognizing that people are sharing their social networks with us is, I think, incredibly important. And I would say too, that I think one of our goals in the tenant union right now is to like both build autonomous organizations of unhoused people, but also to build them in, like to build them with our union, right? And I think that, you know, by having unhoused tenants at our meetings representing their struggle as a part of the broader movement is also really important, because we're not just building tenant associations and buildings, we're building local chapters that include, you know, like our entire neighborhoods. And so centering the needs of unhoused people in those structures, right? Like not necessarily, like not segregating people based on whether the state is their landlord or a corporation is their landlord, or like, you know, they have some mom and pop asshole, is I think also really important. I know I just talked for a while, so I'm going to let Leo jump in.
No, I mean, as an organizer, I think this goes back to part of what I was saying earlier, right? Ideologically, we're told we're organized to look at all of these problems differently and separately from each other. And the whole point, I think, for us is to build the relationships across that make the larger change possible. And that's, you know, you start also with questioning our own ideology as organizers, or how we look at the issue. Like the whole notion, you know, they don't have a landlord. I mean, I would say the landlord is the state. The landlord is whoever is around them that defines how they're going to live, where they're going to live, how much it's going to cost them. Because it costs people, you know, they give them tickets, they push them and displace them and replace them. And so it's very, very important to understand that there is a relationship that controls where people can live and that forces them to be in that kinds of conditions. That's part one. The other thing is, I mean, when I started organizing in public housing, I didn't know anything about public housing. So my choice was to talk to the community and say, okay, we're going to learn this thing together. And as we learn together, we're going to build the organization that's going to help us fight. So I think it's very, very important, as if we're saying that we're centered on the most marginalized, most oppressed, it is very important to understand how we see the world, how they see the world, how we see the world, and how within that contradiction, we create a new vision of the world. And that's a pedagogical organizing process that starts with a dialogue, as Tracy is saying, listening. So it takes time. In our own within the larger tenants union, our original, for those of us who had the education and the practice and the this and the that, we were saying, oh, you know, it has to be everybody who has no control of their housing. But when you go to the community, there's contradictions, how they look at the homeless. So the organization and the organizing becomes the place where we struggle out those contradictions. In our community, during the food distribution, for example, when we go to the tenants who are in rental housing, we distribute food and we go place to place. The community themselves started realizing that, you know, they had this little extra food every time after they distributed, and they knew that they had homeless people living around the corner, very close to them, and they said, well, we should cook something for them because they don't have kitchens, they don't have the means to do that stuff. And they started cooking food people for the community, for the homeless people in the community, and all of a sudden they built a bridge with each other that then produce the conditions of solidarity. When the police try to push them out, they start saying, we're going to defend you, we're going to be with you. So it's relationship building, is getting internalizing the knowledge of what's happening in the community and dialoguing it out. And it's also breaking away from the perspective that tells us, oh, there is only one way of doing things. It's doing things with, doing things together, and building up the organization that allows for us to make that happen. And I will push again even further, you know, it's not an individual. We need to do this collectively. We need to build the collectivities across the city that make these things happen, which is very important in the tenants union. In the tenants union, everybody is a volunteer. Nobody gets paid to organize. And we need to be able to separate our jobs from our commitment to change society. And I mean, and I don't know where this is going to go, but I love my friends who live in the nonprofit world and that get paid in the nonprofit world to change the world. But that's just a job. The job of change, you don't get paid to have a revolution. You don't get paid to change the world. We have to look beyond that. And we need to understand that we have to be able to do what we ask others to do. When we organize tenants, we're asking them that after they work their 2 jobs and their 3 jobs, and they have to take care of the children and their families and feed themselves and all that stuff, we're asking them to come to the meeting and to join the campaign or to join the march, to do stuff. But the same happened to us as organizers now. And that's what I think is very, very important, to build a society, a culture of solidarity that goes that goes beyond our everyday jobs within the capitalist system, which is the thing that we're trying to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will go ahead and ask this one before we move into the next one. So Joshua Palmer, who's from the Puget Sound Tenants Union, is joined in, had a few different questions, but one that I was gonna pull out um, uh, is this notion. So love the emphasis on building power to gain short-term wins, but what's the connective tissue that you see between short-term wins around conditions and the need for this broader, revolutionary transformation that you're talking about? How do you, and another way that he said it is, how do you transform from, tenant union consciousness to revolutionary consciousness? Like, what does that process look like for both of you?
You want to start, and then
I mean, this is a very interesting question, and we're in the context of history, and we also need to understand our conditions in the United States. I mean, the whole idea that we have to change our conscience and the revolution is going to happen. We need to look at the relationship the United States has with the rest of the world, and the role that ideology and anti-communism and all these fears of organizing and the fears of conflict and struggle have emerged now. So I'm sorry to say that this is a long, protracted, slow transforming process that we have to deal with, and the mechanistic understanding that we move from step 1 to B to C is good in guiding us how we do our work, but we need to understand that it takes a long time. I just talked a few seconds ago about the relationship between people who are housed, quote unquote, and the people who are unhoused. There is a stratification, an ideological stratification. The homeowner looks down on the tenant looks down on the homeless, and so on and so forth. And the homeowner is not owner of their house because the bank owns their house, and the tenant is not owner of their house because the landlord owns their house, and the unhoused people are not owners of the stuff. But interestingly, in the case of Echo Park, the unhoused people showed us what we have to do. What we have to do is take over space, turn that space into the space that we need, and then from there we fight. And then the state is going to come and attack us. And that's where the learning happens. So I think the transition happens as people start doing the things that they need. An interesting example for us in Boyle Heights, our community, we deal with a lot of issues with traffic. When people have to, because we're in the way of downtown, so as people are trying to go to downtown, traffic speeds up as they go through a neighborhood. And our tenants forever are always struggling to have better stop lights and stop signs and stuff like that. At some point in our committees, they have changed that position. Basically, they put their own stop signs. They paint their own zebra lines on the street, to slow down traffic. And sometimes the city doesn't even know. And also we have our own crossing guards. Over time, as we've done this discipline and we've developed these practices, the state comes to us and says, what do you guys want? And interestingly, the community doesn't retreat and say, oh, we're not going to do this anymore. On the contrary, say, well, screw you. You've never done this for us. We have to do it ourselves, and we have to push you. So little by little, our community has learned an understanding of what is the relationship to the state. And they have developed an understanding of what is the neighborhood, the urban setting, the urban amenities that they need. And we also put the bus stops. So it is a historic process of taking control of your own world. And then when the state comes to you or have to confront the state, to take it to the next level and the next level and the next level. And that's what happens. It's moving. What I call a lot is acting our way into thinking, not thinking our way into acting. So we're thinking we're going to bring revolutionary consciousness so people act revolutionary. Boy, you're going to have a lot of work to do. But you say, let's act in the context as revolutionaries so people start realizing what a revolution looks like. Things are going to be different. So I just think we need to change our way from thinking our way into acting to acting our way into thinking. That's very, very important to get to revolutionary consciousness. Now, this is just a union within a city, within a larger movement. There is a whole thing that needs to change at the larger level. There is a whole thing that has to change with the unions. I remember going to unions and saying, are you going to help us in the struggle? I say, oh, no. The development and construction is good for us. And then when their members are being displaced, they say, oh, shit, our members cannot live in the city. Well, that's because they chose their own stratification, their own way of doing things. So let's look at it historically. let's look at all the institutions and entities that exist around us, and let's act our way into thinking those organizations out of the way.
Yeah, just to echo what Leo said, I feel like that, I think that we often think, and we've had this question before, like, how do you keep people in the union when, they solve the problem in the building? And I think that in that sense, right, this is why we emphasize claiming territory and thinking about land struggle rather than housing struggle, right? Because your needs don't end in your apartment building. Your needs don't end at your front door, right? They continue as you go to like a street that doesn't have enough stoplights, where we have another example where we talk about the reclaiming of alleys where people were like, where one tenant was like brutally beat up, right? So like, and using that as the context of reclaiming those alleys into the public parks of the neighborhood in many ways. And so I think that part of moving from the short-term wins to the longer-term wins is traveling alongside people as we claim control over more and more territory, as we ask ourselves, like, what are the needs that we're having? Like if we've solved the problem of our leaky faucet or our busted appliance, right? Like, have you looked outside? That hasn't solved every problem. But also understanding that, a tenant union can be an institution, like an infrastructure that solves way more problems than the leaky faucet and the busted appliance, right? Like, it can solve more problems than just the landlord directly, right? Like, it's a form of organization that brings people together who share space, and thus share like a fundamental feature of their lives, and thus share like a lot of the same struggles. And so I think that as we move from our units to our buildings, to our blocks, to our neighborhoods, we can travel along the lines of the short-term wins to those long-term political horizons. And that is as Leo said, very slow, but I think for me that's the trajectory of walking towards that horizon.
Yes, and I think, to start off as a point of departure, we have a political, pedagogical, methodological attitude towards change. Political in the sense that long term we want to build power, and power means to have an effect on our conditions. So as Tracy said, if we fix our conditions in our building, well, we have to look outside of the building, how we change those conditions, and how we exert power to make those conditions change. So build power to change the conditions. Pedagogical in the sense that it is not just, oh, let's fix things. It is, what is the purpose of organizing ourselves to fix the things ourselves? Because that's where we start with a process. We fix the things ourselves so we can teach and show people that how is it that things get fixed, and start thinking of the relationships that things have to each other, right? So in the context of the stoplights, when people start slowing down traffic, they start asking questions about why do we need stoplights and what happens, and then the relationship to the state. And then pedagogical in the sense that it is a learning process. We're always learning together towards the vision that we want to have, and that vision is constructed in the process itself, right? We don't need housing that is screwed up and is destroyed in cities that have lots of potholes where traffic is not respected, without an organization that cannot produce those changes. So we have to see ourselves as an organization that builds power, is teaching, and builds the mechanisms to continue learning how to do these things at a larger and larger scale. And I forgot, and the other part is the social process, right? The tenants union is 16 locals across the city doing the same kind of learning, and then coming together and learning from each other what to do, how to do it. And then, we have to get away from the temptations of following the guidelines and the solutions of the nonprofit industrial complex that is a subcontractor of foundations who are our replenishers and supporters of the state.
Amen. So I want to talk about the kind of creative, aspects. Get into some of that pedagogy too, and some of the different Yeah, so there's a piece, you talk about how transforming reality is an unmistakably creative project. It demands imagination, experimentation, improvisation. It takes a lot of play. This is from a quote. You say, "In our union, we engage in what Brazil's landless workers movement (MST) calls mystica: performances, rituals, symbols, and celebrations that sustain the struggle." So yeah, Leonardo, you also mentioned earlier your background in liberation theology. There's the term convivir that comes up in the book multiple times. So can you share some examples of kind of the things that you're talking about here?
Well, so my part of the is yeah. It's funny. I'm going to talk a little bit of my personal history, but basically, when I was in college, I started reading a lot about Latin American because I've come from Mexico, I'm an immigrant, and I was very interested in the struggles that were happening in our context. And in that context, I discovered the whole idea of liberation theology, and was very very interested. And because liberation theology teaches within their own context, the whole idea is that yeah, so let's go there. So in the context of the reading of a Christian tradition, God appears to the most poor, but in a context where it's very very interesting. So if we look at the Old Testament, it is the slaves who are the first ones who meet God, and God says, I'm going to take you out of a land of milk and honey, and then they're going to do that. But it is the slaves themselves who do their own liberation. It is the slaves themselves who engage in that process. So first of all, is the concentration of the most poor, but also understand that it is the people themselves who have to engage in that struggle. But also in the context of a vision. And I think a lot of times in our communities, in our processes, the vision stays with the organizer or with the people who are building the organization, stuff like that. And the community are just agents that are pushed around in all this process. We need to really be focused and centered on the vision that people have for their everyday life. And then, so people who are working to pay rent to live in their homes are not organizing themselves to always live to work. They want to work to live. And that contradiction is very, very important for us to explore and to build from there. What is the life that you want for your family, for your children, for your friends, for your partner, for the community that you live in? What is that vision? What are your desires that come from that? And we need to, in our organization, we talk about those desires. Why did we, in the larger immigrant community, why did we come to the United States? Amongst the students, why are you studying, what you're studying, what is the life that you have to live? And those things, those visions, those aspirations have to be present in everything. So it's the invisible that makes us happen, that makes us go, that are the sides that makes us go. And the challenge for the organization is how to make that visible. Another part of it is how in the struggle, out of our struggles, out of campaigns, out of our coming together to launch the rent strike, how we build the unity, the family, the larger social family that we're trying to build with all these values and aspirations. So we need to be self-conscious and self-reflective of all these things that we're building, not in the larger religious sense, but in the sense that these invisible things that are driving us are always there. And these relationship community that are always there. And the MST, they use the word mystica and they refuse to change and translate it because it's really entrenched to their own thing. And when you talk with them about it, they go to the etymology of the word, which is about the mysterious, the invisible. And I think it's important for us in our movement to look at that part that is mysterious and invisible. In Latin America, when the Berlin Wall fell, the liberation theologians were kind of like jokingly laughing at the Marxists because they said, well, those guys had no vision. They only had the mechanistic part of this thing. And when everything fell apart, they didn't know what to do. They started scrambling. But we in the church, the liberation theologians had the mystic, had this mysterious part that helped us visualize this thing. So in the Tenants Union, over time, we've developed our own symbology, our own understanding of what represents those things. The logo of the Tenants Union, the tools that we use, the lock, what do you call it? What we cut the locks with,
Bolt cutters.
the bolt cutters. All these little things, little by little. Our T-shirts. When we bring all these things together, we'll come together with our T-shirts together with our bolt cutters, marching on the street. We see the symbology of a procession. So language we have to change. We see the procession of the people going to the landlord and saying, "Screw you! We have the power. We're going to silence them." So Mystica is about paying attention to those invisible things, but they're always present around us. It's about the vision of the people towards something better that is built as they're doing that. Is the people in Echo Park building the community with food, housing, harm reduction, mutual support that teaches that. So it's about self-consciousness, self-awareness of what keeps us going. The other, you were saying something else about the Mystica and the well,
Convivir, the
oh,
that term.
convivir. An interesting story with our local. When we had food is very, very important in our local. There's a lot of food. We always come together to have food. We always celebrate the lives of people, the birthday parties, lots of different things. So a meeting is not just a place where we decide and plan the next action. A meeting is also a fun place where people come to gossip about each other, to make jokes, to hang out and doing all these things. And but also is where the tools for everyday life are used to build organizations. So an interesting thing, on the early days of our local, we were meeting on parking lots without any, very, very cold. There was a winter, was very, very cold. And we had senior citizens, women senior citizens that were like extremely cold. And they kept going to the meetings and they said, oh, we don't have a place to stay. What can we find a place? And we're fighting different kind of organizations that were not really supporting us. So we said, well, we don't have a place. One day, a group of women started collecting money from the larger collective, and they decided to put together money for the rent. So they gave us the money to organize it. So you guys go find a house. We're gonna rent that house. So after that, every day the people would get together in the house to eat, but they would pay for the food to make these things happen. So that's how we start paying the rent of the office so we could have an office. So that coming together of people as community with their own tools, the eating and the thing is the convivencia, the coming together and living together. And that's how we do that in that spirit, cleaning the neighborhood. Tracy was talking earlier. No, I read on some other local that they just launched. And the first thing that they did was cleaning their neighborhood. So it's doing the things that we usually do in our own home, but not together as a larger community. Eating together, cleaning together, working together, transforming the building together. So those are the things that we're bringing to this moment from that other tradition that we want to continue happening. Paying attention to invisible and seeing life beyond just the organizing, the structural, political, ideological machine that makes things happen, but really looking at the social constructing process that changes the world. I don't know if that was too much rambling.
No. I mean, I could just add and say that, to me, like Mystica is like part of, like, as Leo was talking about, it's about the symbols that are co-developed and a language that you speak, that is like a language that a language that you want to bring others into, right? So when we have I think my favorite example is like the 7-foot vulture landlord puppet that like comes to our marches, right? Because that is both, it's a demonstration of like the critique that landlords are vultures on our society. And we often chant like vulture landlords get a real job alongside this like beautiful handmade puppet who's 7 feet tall. And I think that there's something, part of it is like, he's both funny, but also it is dead serious to suggest that your landlord like is not doing like socially functioning labor and should actually be made to get a real job. And I think that for me, it's about merging the kind of ideological and organized interventions with the kind of like spirit that allows us to continue. And sometimes you need humor in that. And sometimes you need the things that sustain you, like food and celebration. And, I think that those two things really combine into like something called faith. And I know that it's like, and I don't mean that in a religious sense, but as we were saying earlier, right? Like to go from with the tools that we have to the long-term goal of revolutionizing the way that we treat housing as a society, like to go from tenants who don't control their housing to tenants who are collectively organizing land and our own resources, right? That is like a long-term process that people that we need to sustain each other along the way. And so some of how we do that, is like by these gestures, by these languages, by these like co-created like spirit that is about building that spirit or that faith, or that spirit and that faith and that sense of real possibility. Because I think that, like, you know, in the face of a system that is about denying that anything else is possible, we have to build the offensive power to push back against that. And so much of what, you know, it's not necessarily just about like denouncing like the thing that like immiserates us and like is wrecking our lives, right? But it's also about building that community, that like announcing like, oh, like something else is possible, and we can see it when we come together. We can see it when we laugh with each other. Like we can see it when we like take up space.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
You're muted.
Hang on. There you go.
So since we're using spirit and faith as words in this process, I'm also going to add one more, which is hope, you know, and the hope against all hope is very, very important. And I mean hope, not optimism, because I have a whole critique on being optimistic, you know. I mean, things are screwed up. Things are messed up. Life is not easy. But hope takes us to another thing that is beyond that. And I think in the example of the mariachis, you know, the hope that they could stay there under rent control conditions, once against everything in the world that was being told to them, as Tracy described before, you know, it was against the desire to go on strike was against the advice of the lawyers. The desire to modify the rent was against the whole legal system that decides who gets to pay how much rent and all that stuff. The desire to organize for that struggle goes against any nonprofit tenant organization campaign that they want to do. So the hope of the tenants took us to a different kind of place, because they hoped that it could be possible. They were not optimistic about it, but they hoped that they could make that happen. And it was possible because they put their faith and they had the spirit to make it happen. And there was a whole community to do this thing. The hope of the people who took over Echo Park to protect themselves and to stay there while the pandemic was killing everybody. The hope that they could build a community where they could protect themselves was also very, very important, because then it brought all of us in support of them when the police tried to displace them. So hope is very, very important in this thing. And hope is about the announcing what we want and denouncing that the system that we live in. The hope of the tenants in Mariachi Plaza, in the Mariachi building, denounce the legal, the advocates, and the nonprofits who say nothing is possible, that's just the way it is, and show the contradiction of the system. So to take another word, the whole world of prophetic, which we learned from Martin Luther King and all these places, the prophet announces a world that is to become as it denounces the world that we have here right now. The tenants union is trying to build that notion, that experience, that practice, and that vision of the world, to announce a world that is coming, because we want to make it happen just like the mariachis, against a world that is telling us you cannot do that. It is the hope of the Palestinians. It is the hope of the movement that is trying to support Palestine, that fights and struggles for people's right to be in a place, right to be in a place that they choose, right to be in a place where they've been building their community and their lives. All our communities that we work in the tenants union we're talking about people who have committed their lives to the neighborhoods that they live in, and they have a right to remain. And the state is telling them, oh no, you can go where you want, where you can afford your rent, but screw that. People build a community where they're living, and it's the right to remain. So hope on the right to remain with the conditions that you want, and to create a world that allows you to stay there forever and ever.
I love that. Appreciated. Yeah, I mean, some folks have brought up questions in the chat of, you know, the importance. What to you is the importance of kind of naming that world that you want to become, right? And some folks have asked, is this socialism? There's also the term that you use in the text. Obviously, it's called Abolish Rent. You use the term rent abolition within the text. You write, rent abolition is a practice of occupation and a process of socialization the tenant struggle is a land struggle, as you referenced earlier. It is a struggle for collective sovereignty over the use of our resources and the places we inhabit. End quote. And so, yeah, I mean, one, I think the initial question I had was to talk about some of the communities that you write in the book and how they embody these ideas. But also, I think maybe saying a little bit more about where, for you all as organizers and as people who have been a part of this movement, do you think about that importance of naming what you want to see?
I mean, I think part of the impetus for writing this book was in some ways to take back what has become a cliche, which is housing is a human right. But that is in its, I mean, on the face of it, right? That is the world that we're seeking, right? Is the, as Leo was saying, like the right to remain, the right to return, the right to have a place and to have control over where you are. And I think that, it's like partly we've let this phrase, I mean, housing is a human right, because become a cliche. And it's about like reviving the revolutionary spirit behind the transformations that would be necessary in order to give us that right, right? So like rent abolition is a horizon, right? It is what it means, like, for us when we talk about the tenant movement, like that horizon of having control, of being able to recirculate our own resources to democratically manage what we want to do with them in the places where we are, and to have that collective control over our lives. And then I think also, it's like rent abolition is also a practice, right? It's something that's happening right now that we can sort of see in those moments when tenants are like on rent strike. And for the first time in their lives, they don't have to fucking pay a landlord to have housing, right? Like that experience that we get for just like a moment. I think it's really important to name that as like something that we want to expand, right? So to like claim the horizon then is also to give us a criteria now for how we should organize and what are the kinds of strategies that displace our landlord's power over us and that build our own power, right? And that's both talking about like forms of reform, but it's also talking about like, what are the kinds of organizations that we need to build? What are the kind of, how do we as a community, how should we make decisions in a way that models a future society where we have democratic control over our resources and the land that we're on? And so I think that it gives us, I think that for me, naming the horizon, and I think this is a really great question, but for me, naming the horizon is both about claiming that like a radically transformed system is possible, and we both need, and I know that it seems strange, and maybe it's the paradox of naming that both as something that is deeply normal. It is completely basic to say that you need a home to survive and therefore you should have one. That is completely normal. And at the same time, it is deeply revolutionary. It is utterly transformative. The kind of society that we would need in order to give people that super normal, basic thing is like, that is a transformation of our property relations, of our economic system, of our political system. And so for me, it's about like naming the horizon is both a way to honor what tenants are doing right now, both in occupying like public space and encampments and in occupying their homes by like, even in the slow process of doing their own repairs and then like, not paying rent. It's a way of honoring that. And it's a way of navigating that like deeply contradictory thing, that's something that we want that should be so normal is actually like utterly revolutionary. And I think for me, it's about, like naming rent abolition as something that's as a horizon and that's a practice, is a way of navigating that tension, that paradox.
Yeah, and I think we can apply that kind of system to naming socialism and all these things. But I think what's important is to understand that I mean, I'm not pessimistic, but I'm looking at things where they're at, and my hope is that at some point we can say we have a socialist United States, but it's in the construction of these relationships, the social relationships where people come together and share their goods and their food, so they can have an office. In the construction of people sharing and supporting, so people to help people pay their rent and all these things, that we build the practice and the experience of what later we need to name. And I think in the process, in different locals, they're naming this process at different moments and at different times. We have a community where one of the leaders already says, we have a communism of community, because as we're building this community, we're building this communism of community. So she names with a communism with a last name or with an adjective. But I think people themselves, as they build their experiences, are naming these things. And those of us who like want to jump to the point and to all this stuff, it's very important for us to first build the practices, be part of those practices, so later on we can put a name on those things as we actually have experienced them and lived them. Because going back to my thing about acting our way into things, it's very, very important to have the experience, so people don't question the word or the name, but really look at the practice and say, oh, this is what this is called. So it is important to name things, but also it's important to name them as we build the practice. And I think in a lot of levels, in our community, one thing that I joke around, we have a corner where we have a stoplight, we have a stoplight, we have a bench to wait for the bus. We have covered all these potholes, and we have an alley that we clean, and we have food distribution that comes out of the community. All of those things have happened because the community has organized themselves to demand and to make to build these things. And over time, they're really, I say, they're like an urban community, an urban autonomous community that tells the state what they need to do whenever they want to do. They're in practice to be the managers of the state. Imagine if we multiply that then across all the blocks in the neighborhood. Imagine if we multiply that across the whole thing. Then we can name, we run the state. But communities little by little are learning to run the state by the practices they engage in. So yes, let's name it, but as we build the practice. Because if we want to just name it without having the practice, we're going to have a long-term protracted struggle just for people to change their frame of mind. You change your way of doing. Well, Paulo Freire says that, as you change the world, you change your mind, and the world changes you, and then you go back again in this whole circle. So we need to continue changing the world, so we change our mind, and then we change the world that changes us. And name it as the process comes on.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot. A couple of kind of like, we're winding down. I want to pull up a couple things from the audience too, a couple more things. So one question is about topics of like counterinsurgency and co-optation in the context of tenant struggle. To Joshua, this looks like toothless reforms, channeling activist labor into policy advocacy, how to combat this. And related, Sterling from Philadelphia Housing Action asks, yeah, we love Sterling. This is talking about different ways that people kind of co-opt movements or weaponize, use them for their own ends. There's a speaking circuit that surrounds any large campaign, how to avoid these issues, how to deal with people wanting a piece of victories, or even people raising money off of the organizing. So this kind of goes back, I think this comment was made as you were all talking about kind of the democratic nature and like avoiding certain relationships with nonprofits and so on. But just thinking about this as people start to build and they see the ability to get wins, right? That sometimes that can also be, okay, we've achieved some form of success or we have a win, right? And how to avoid that becoming something that then, different forces are able to use to sort of demobilize this kind of movement.
Go ahead.
Do you want to go first?
Well, it's just funny. I just react to the first question because the whole, I don't think the tenants union is about policy making. And actually it's funny because we have little debates here and there. And the first thing we shut down is the policy makers. I'm not going to say that we're a monolith where everybody thinks the same. We have our debates and our contradictions, but when it comes to the whole idea of policy making, to me that just doesn't make sense. As I was saying earlier, with LA, after the reaction of LA Tenants Union and the appearance of LA Tenants Union, boy, our rights started expanding across the city, for the tenants. And it was all the nonprofits and the politicians who were saying, oh, well, let's give them more rights, let's give them more rights, so they get silent. But the rights were not producing any result on anybody's life. The rights were not doing anything. Basically, people have to go to court, on eviction court, to defend their rights. So that's just silly. When we start fighting, when we start declaring the food not rent campaign, people say, oh, we need the right policies to stop. And people say, shit, we're just not going to pay rent, and we're going to organize in a right way. So policy is not the goal of the tenants union, and policy is not the world of this whole process. It appears as some of the tactics. And I think another thing that happens with these conversations is that we confuse the tactic with the strategy. Getting a new policy is just a tactic. Get a politician to listen to you is just a tactic. The strategy is to change the condition, the larger conditions and the larger relationships. So all these tactics are just tactics. And within the nonprofit sector, yes, they confuse the strategy. Their goal was to become friends with the state so they could do whatever they wanted. That's just a tactic, and they're stuck there. The tenants union doesn't see to be stuck there, looks at the beyond that we've been just talking about. But we have to understand that we're just part of a larger movement, part of a larger anti-capitalist movement, and we cannot, as much as I claim, there's most of the labor live in our neighborhoods. The larger anti-capitalist struggle is part of larger movements that are across the place, and to put the demands on just one little tiny itsy minority within a city in the beginning of this process, well, let's wait and see what's going to happen. That's one part that I think is very important. So it's about building unity, it's about building the tools for change, and it's about people being self-conscious about this process so that we can, as we join the larger movements, and by larger I mean the larger international anti-communist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist movement, then we can produce those changes. The United States is in the center of this whole process. We're seeing in the context of Palestine, and we're seeing how our protests and our marches are still not producing this stuff. We still need a different kind of structure, a different part of way of doing this stuff. And the tenants union is just one small part of that. But we agree with the notion of remaining, the right to return, and all these notions, which have a larger global process. We understand that our control is not just about our homes, but about controlling the neighborhood and then the city. So we're looking beyond the tactics of formal politics. We're talking about the politics of building power to create the society we need at a social, political, economic level. And it's going to have different looks and different locals in different cities. But boy, do we need a larger structure and a larger movement to make this thing happen.
Yeah, I just want to say that, I mean, for me, there's almost like a, I think that if we ground ourselves over and over in the tenants that we organize with, and in the conditions of the most vulnerable amongst us, we will never be guilty. We will never have the opportunity to be co-opted for a very long time. And I think that, but I also think that it's okay to situate policy in our tactical arsenal as long as we don't confuse it with strategy, right? Like these are plateaus that our movement can reach to help us organize further, right? But when we think about orienting ourselves around the most vulnerable, then the policies that are the concessions, like, if we think about, if we frame our policy wins in the history of class struggle, then anything we're winning is going to be a concession that will never be good enough, right? At least for the foreseeable future. And then I think that it's helpful for us to think about those as, simply plateaus and ways to continue to organize. Like I think about, a build like the mariachi tenants winning stabilization for their building and reflecting to themselves around how now they can stabilize the movement, right? They can be a base of power in that community. And I think that for us, it's about building those beachheads in different neighborhoods, in different places as we claim those smaller wins and thinking about, I think that we can think about extracting concessions in a similar way. But I think as long as we are reflecting on the needs of the most vulnerable and the most poor, we have an orientation that will like guide us to the transformation of society that we need. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and also in the construction of territory, I think is a very good example. I mean, I'll give you the example of Boyle Heights. Over time, with all these little tactics and little struggles, we've been able to build a community of TAs across several mile squares of our neighborhood, which is Boyle Heights. As the city, for example, developed this idea of creating an arts district, we were able to bring all of these people together to push out galleries. I mean, we had like, I don't know how many galleries at this point. There was more like 20 or 30 galleries at this point where we have to fight, because we knew that bringing the galleries into our neighborhood was going to be like a tremendous wave of gentrification against public housing and the tenants. And our organization, our local, the Unión de Vecinos Eastside Local, is joined with the communists, with the Maoists, with the anarchists, with the artists and everybody, and held the struggle to the point where there is no more galleries in our neighborhood. And that happened not just because we made policy changes or anything like that, but because we built neighborhoods, committees across the neighborhood that were able to come together and say, we're going to push back, and provided the leadership and the space for the organizations to help us in that struggle. But the beneficiaries were, guess what? The public housing residents that in 1996 were fighting against the demolition of the housing project, who were now being threatened with the privatization of their management and long-term privatization of their building. The galleries were going to accelerate that process. We stopped that process, and right now we have an empty corridor of empty warehouses where the galleries were going to be. That didn't happen because we did policy wins. That happened because we built organizations at the neighborhood level in different parts of Boyle Heights.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. This has been excellent. Again, I really did enjoy the book thoroughly, and I encourage folks to pick it up, to read it, to study. Let somebody reach out from Fresno that wants to try to bring you out to have a conversation. So I will try to connect you all. Yeah, this has been great. Much appreciated. Thank you for all of your time, and great conversation, great discussion today.
So great to be back. Thanks so much for having us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. This was great. All right. Have a good one, y'all. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thank you.